Well, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. The new assignment, I'm the newly elected Executive Director of the Fund for responding to loss and damage, which will start on November 1st. And I'd like to thank and congratulate Egypt for actually making it happen from COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. So today, the fact that we have an ED that come from Africa is also the great work of Egypt, and I want to congratulate Egypt for the support that you provided. I mean, I wanted to just put two things on the table, and that is the problem that we're faced with when it comes to climate change and the continent, but also maybe some of the solutions that hopefully the panel will discuss in our various capacities. I think, unfortunately, and this is something we can all agree with, the extreme weather conditions are getting worse on the continent, they're not getting better. And that extreme weather condition has two major impacts that we all can agree on, and that is the human losses and the economic losses in the continent. In fact, it's been estimated that about $50 billion, particularly in terms of losses on the economic side, will be actually experienced by 2050, and about 250,000 people probably will be lost on the continent. And all of this because of the flood and the drought that we see across the continent. So the question is, I think this conversation will be very interesting to look at what are some of the options or solutions that we have in addressing these climate issues, and with the hope that the public and the private sector will sort of work together to deliver some of the solutions. Some of the solutions I would put on the table are not theories. These are things that I've experienced when I was running the African Risk Capacity. They do work for the continent. And number one is, how do we actually mainstream early warning system, leveraging what science has to offer to make sure that our policymakers have access to data, but also risk information that can help them to make informed decisions. Now, this is extremely critical because early warning system, they can save lives. And I can tell you that in Madagascar, the fact that my previous organization made tropical cyclone information available to the government, it did help the government to move about 5,000 people from harm's way. So I think it'd be good to discuss in this conversation that mainstreaming, knowing the challenges of technology on the continent. How do we make it accessible to policymakers? I think number two, and the minister alluded to this, which is extremely critical, and that is the accessibility and availability of climate finance. It's a bit of a chicken or egg, and that is to say, is it because climate finance is not accessible? Because in Africa, in most countries, the lack of project preparation skills to move the NDCs to actually something actually fundable may just be the reason why funding is not flowing the way we want it. So you cannot fund an idea, you fund something that's actually mature. So maybe the conversation could be what kind of capacity building can we provide to Africa to make sure we can build the project preparation facility across the board. Last thing I wanted to say, in climate finance, the different windows, the different instruments, the minister talked about adaptation and mitigation. I think the one recently been put together is the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. This is extremely critical in the sense while we're actually promoting green economy, private sector involvement, we need to build the resilience. There are many vulnerable communities in Africa who are affected by climate finance, and I think, or by climate changes, I should say, we should find a way to make sure we can build the two together. The last message I want to get across is the need to actually coordinate our intervention on the continent. There are many climate initiatives from Global Shield to GCF and others. Unfortunately, those actually climate instruments need to match the demand and the continent. So hopefully we can have a discussion about how do we make it to be a demand-driven kind of financial climate finance intervention in the continent, as opposed to the other way around. And I think all of this is urgent, and I'm glad that at COP29, the theme of the COP is climate finance, with the hope that we can get new commitment so we can actually make climate finance accessible to developing countries, Africa in particular. Let me stop there, Mr. Moderator. Over to you. Well, the short answer is yes, it can be done. The question is, as I mentioned earlier in my intervention,
and I'll throw in some another twist. Can also be developed. Can also be in the context of development finance. In other words, not just climate, but benefits the entire community where the project is located?
I think, generally speaking, whether it's climate, energy, infrastructure, all the areas Africa needs tremendous resources. Certainly, public money alone, it's not going to do it. So the funding gap is such that the only way you can meet the gap is to combine public money, but also private sector money. So we talked about earlier the reason why private sector money, the three things that can actually drive private sector money, in my view, and I'm speaking to the controller of the World Bank sitting there, is number one, I talked about the importance of project preparation. I happened to be in the government in the previous life where I realized the quality of the project that you put forward looking for funding can have a tremendous impact in terms of whether you can attract funding or not. So the ability to provide capacity building for government to actually have a professionally well-run project preparation facility, in my view, particularly across Africa, is something certainly need to be pushed and pushed very hard in making sure at least we don't actually promote ideas, we promote actually projects that are mature, that are actually fundable, or bankable, as some would say. Now, let me just make it very clear, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Across Africa, there's some countries that are quite advanced in terms of project preparation. There are others that are still kind of in the making in doing so. I think second, generally speaking, also the incentive that's actually provided by government, private sector to go into renewable and other projects that are important in the continent, as important as project preparation. If you look at one person mentioned to me one time, I will not mention the name, government should be in the business of facilitating business, not in the business of doing business. And that is a way of saying the jobs, the 80% of jobs created in most countries are made by the private sector. So any government who's pro-business, pro-private sector has to be provided the incentive that make it possible for private sector to want to put money in that country or not that country or other countries for the matter. So I think the question becomes here, what are the incentives the government can put in place to make it attractive for private sector to actually come in? That certainly may be the way of attracting private sector. Now, just to wrap up, if you look at, for example, and I'm old enough to remember this from my World Bank days, most of the privatization that have taken place in the water sector, in the energy sector, they happen in particular because those government at the time created the incentive to make the private sector to bring in the know-how, the investments, so that we can have the concessions that have taken place in the water sector that have been very successful. I think the water sector in particular is a good example where through proper planning within government, we have to basically bring in the private sector know-how to address a public sector problem. In this case, access to water supply, access to drinking water, and so on. So I think ultimately, the fact that public-private sector works is one thing. The question is, how do you organize along project preparation, incentive provided by government, and eventually making sure that some of the critical public sector issues like water and access to energy and so on are put on the table, that private sector can bring in their know-how and the government can address a public sector problem. And ultimately, I think that's where we're heading to. And I see countries that have done it successfully have a very organized public-private sector, a PPP unit, either within the office of the Prime Minister or Minister of Finance or whatever works for the country. But ultimately, you need to organize a relationship in a way that public sector can bring in their know-how and the private sector obviously will bring in their skills, but in investments. And countries that have done it successfully have been able to actually do it very fast in a way that the private sector can bring in their skills and be able to address the public sector problem.
Thank you. Is there a need to create a global agency that brings public and private instead of doing this on a case-by-case basis?
The short answer is no. Nothing, one of the things I used to enjoy at my World Bank days is think global and act local. And these issues are very, very different from one country to another. It's not a one-size-fits-all. And I think it's important to approach this in a particular localized way, so you can actually address the issues of Egypt very different than the issues of Senegal in other parts of Africa. So I think that's certainly you can learn from one another, but certainly the global private sector PPP kind of unit certainly is not going to address the localized problem on public-private sector partnership. I'm more a champion at looking at this from a particular country perspective and not a one-size-fits-all.